clarity of his language early on climate change. You know, that's to have committed himself through language that was clear to something and then to disappoint, I suppose, is what's got him in difficulty. So it's hardly surprising that instead you hear him saying things like, and I've got a brilliant little piece from some overseas trip that he did a year or two ago, talking about, about climate change. There has to be a greater synergy between, let's call it our policy leadership in this, which has been focused so much legitimately on targets and global architecture, almost reverse engineered back to the means by which you can quickly deliver outcomes. And on the demand side in our economy, we're looking at potential advances in terms of 20 to 25% range if you do this across the board. It all takes cost, but let me tell you, it's probably the quickest lever you can pull given the challenges we face. That's rightly. Or, there are dozens of sticking points on the Doha round right now. Let's just be blunt about it. But where it was before, which was in a pre-glacial position, we're now moving rapidly down the glacier, okay? Except, unlike moving most glaciers, we have 5 weeks to arrive at the end point. You know, it's going to take a bit more to gelignite this thing into gear. But given where things were frozen up until last time. Anyway. The one thing that I'll say about soaring rhetoric, which is always much kinder on the ears, is that it is also anti-democratic in tendency to an extent, in the sense that its pure effectiveness is to disconnect the listener from his or her natural viewpoint. It's to seduce people away from their natural opinions. So there's an element to which fine rhetoric is anti-democratic in nature as well. Now, I know which I'd prefer, whether it's being seduced by a psychopathic orator who happens to be brilliant with language, or bored into submission by someone who has no idea how to use it. But then again, I would say that because I'm a journalist.
Beautiful.
I'm glad that somebody else is also a fan of Steel Fielding's. My favourite of his is, I will go into bat for my fellow Australians who are going to fall off the cliff. I am torn between two places and a hard rock. Now, speaking of being torn between two places and a hard rock, it's my pleasure to... Well, how do you introduce a man like Christopher Hitchens? Welcome to Australia, Hitch.
Thank you. Nice to be back.
Really, words like prolific get cast around with these days, but in Hitch's case, it's really a word that's hard to go past, given the range and scale of the papers that he's written for, the books that he's written, and the experiences that he's had, the commitment to his journalism. And the three examples that I think best typify that for me: writing about torture, submitted himself to waterboarding to see what it was like. Doing an article, submitted himself to Brazilian waxing. It was a full Brazilian, wasn't it?
That was rougher.
Yes.
Because if you need to rip, you have to grip.
And perhaps...
Much worse than for ladies.
The worst torture of all, being smacked on the bum by former Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. Please welcome Christopher Hitchens.
Thank you. Well, I'm rather sad to find that the weed of langue de bois has spread to Australia. I always used to think of Australia as a country where men were men, sheep were nervous, plain speech, a spade was a bloody shovel. It was a relief often to go on ABC from Washington after the terrible drool in which the nation's capital is so frequently drowned. It put me in mind when I was listening to you of a Harold Pinter-esque monologue about the public lavatory attendant. I don't know if I can render it into Australia. I probably can. The attendant is doing a monologue speaking about his woes, the difficulties of the job. Because people come in there, he says, for practically anything, any reason except the real one. So you got flashers who come in here, you've got transvestites coming in here, You've got buggers and sodomites of all kinds coming here, people fleeing the police. When someone comes in for a good, honest shit, it's like a breath of fresh air. And you knew what he wanted to say. And I'm always trying to help people finish these sentences. And I remember very vividly staying at the old Mayflower Hotel in New York during the 1992 Democratic Convention, which was a huge fiesta of euphemism and drivel. And it was very nice to be woken up quite early in the morning and hear the almost hypnotically soothing and reassuring tones of Philip Adams. I think you know what I'm talking about. And he said, well, Christopher, can you just update us on the status of things here? Would you say, for example, that as we seem to be understanding that the Ross Perot campaign is now going down the gurgler? And I thought you wouldn't get that on the BBC. You wouldn't get that on NBC. They'd have found a less flowery but much less accurate way of putting it. And it enabled me to say, actually, in my view, the Ross Perot campaign originated in the gurgler and may well be returning to whence it came. As I say about the Tea Party movement now and all similar populist movements, what it proves is all politics is yokel. Well, the other thing to say is that the stakes, as you both mentioned, both my predecessor speakers mentioned, are quite high. Polluting the world of language is a threat to democracy, a very direct one, and you can very often tell it by the sinister intentions of those who want to promote what the French used to call the langue du bois, the wooden tongue. There's a fully expressed intention of lying, if not obfuscating, flat-out lying when this happens. Claude Cockburn, a heroic figure of British radical journalism, needed to live as long as he did to make up for the time he spent in the Communist Party in the 1930s working on the Daily Worker, where he was one day idly scanning a communique they planned to reprint from Moscow, instructing the party on how to proceed, where he came across the sentence, actually not the sentence, the imperative injunction that the leading organs of the party must penetrate the backward parts of the proletariat. And when he said to the comrades, look, I'm not sure this is going to fly in Doncaster, Glasgow and other places where they sing, he said, no, but it's from Moscow, we've got to print it. And George Orwell, who I was glad you mentioned, was very vigilant about this in his work on politics in the English language and thought there was a real relationship, important, intimate relationship between language, truth, and logic. And you can notice when people have completely decoupled language from its meaning, and it's often to do with mixture of metaphor, so that again from Prague to Rotas you would hear the jackboot has been thrown into the melting pot. The fascist octopus has sung its swan song. And things of this kind, where it was perfectly clear that it was just quacking now, barking. And that's the origin of Newspeak. I'm going to come back to Newspeak. I'm going to end on it if I'm allowed to get that far. W.H. Auden made the same intuitive connection in 1968 when the armies of the Warsaw Pact occupied Czechoslovakia. He wrote a very short poem from just across the border in Kirkstetten in Austria because he saw the propaganda that had been used to justify this atrocity. It's a provocation against the existence of the Czechoslovak regime was a provocation against the Soviet Union. Those who thought otherwise were banging the drum for the Cold War. All of these terrible langue du bois expressions. And he wrote a short poem. It's called August 1968, and it goes like this. The ogre does what ogres can. Deeds quite impossible for man. But one prize is beyond his reach. The ogre cannot master speech. About a subjugated plain, amid the terrorized and the slain, the ogre stalks with hands on hips, while drivel gushes from his lips. It was the perfect encapsulation of the langue du bois and its relationship to aggression and totalitarianism. And it's better than an irony of history, it's a real vindication. That only 21 years later, the Czechoslovak people freed themselves from this regime without anyone losing even a fingernail, without a shot being fired, in a movement led by poets and dramatists and essayists and ironists who simply by folding their arms and mocking the system made it go away like the Kingdom of Oz. This is the high stakes that we play for. This is why it is funny, but it's also Very serious.